All right, and welcome to the Bullfish Hole podcast. Today I'm talking to Larry Nichols, Professor Emeritus at West Virginia University, a longtime editor of the journal The American Sociologist, and just 2 weeks ago, the winner of the North Central Sociological Association's J. Milton Yinger Lifetime Award for a Distinguished Career in Sociology. And today we're going to discuss Larry's recently published book, Reintroducing Pitirim A. Sorokin, Integral Loving Global Sociology. The book covers someone who's an often overlooked figure in the field. He, in some ways, was fairly central to early 20th century sociology or mid-20th century sociology. He worked alongside Talcott Parsons, who no one reads these days, but people still at least talk about. He trained Robert Merton, who people do still read. But in other ways, he was at the margins of the field, and his influence waned fairly drastically over time, to the point where, at least when I was coming up in grad school, you had to be a big nerd for the history of the field to even have heard of him. And so this book is clearly an attempt to reintroduce him to the field. It covers his biography and the breadth of his intellectual output. And it's a book that's clearly a labor of love, because I think you were working on this when I first met you like 15 years ago. And you've published it after you've escaped this place and don't have a yearly review breathing down your neck. So this is something that, as a subject, you've clearly had a strong interest in. And I guess I'm going to start off the interview with that question. What got you interested in Sorokin?
Now, we didn't get off to a good start, really. I was at St. Louis University. I was doing master's work and under a professor named Clement Mihanovich, who was a kind of a big formal sociologist, guy like Zimmel and von Wiese, and which he thought connected with the kind of Thomistic philosophy of the university, and this form and content approach. It seemed like it fit with the Aristotelian, categories that they were familiar with. And so we didn't really hear of Sorokin as an undergraduate. In undergraduate, a lot of it was kind of current social problems, which is what a lot of people think of sociology as being. I took things like juvenile delinquency, social control, police community relations, population problems, a lot of current problems type of stuff. Because, a century ago, sociology was thought to focus on social pathology. If you look at some of the old course catalogs, an awful lot was under that heading. Or the Chicago people said social disorganization, which was, similar. So then in grad school, there were a 2-course sequence on European social theorists and American social theorists. So again, under Mihanovich, I was their theory person. And to me, this was like a new world. It's like, well, why didn't we talk about this stuff when we were undergraduates? Like, this is the good stuff, So we went through the Europeans. And then in the Americans, Sorokin was mentioned in a book by Alvin Boscoff that was used. So Boscoff helped to kind of bring him back into the conversation a little bit. So that book was around 1970. So I think that was when I first, encountered him. But then about the same time, I was doing an independent reading course on Zimmel. And, I say Mihanovich liked Zimmel. And, so I was liking Zimmel. And I read Sorokin's treatment of Zimmel in his book, Contemporary Sociological Theories, which was a 1928 book, which was extremely influential, which was taught in places like Sweden, Turkey, China, all over the place. And it was a very harsh critique of Zimmel. I said, boy, this guy is rough. This guy is really rough, Well, of course, the Russian school of intellectual combat, and Sorokin, having gone through, as you now know, the political wars, and debating publicly with people like Trotsky, it's just, take no prisoners. So it made a bad impression on me. But then I encountered the social and cultural dynamics, and it kind of blew me away because it was so different than anything I had read. And I had, meanwhile, been increasingly interested in this idea of meaningfulness, and not just interaction, but meaningfulness. We've been reading a little bit of Mead and Mannheim and McKeever, and they were all focused one way or another on meaningfulness. And then Sorokin made this central. But then the first volume of this massive 4-volume work, and each volume is about 1,000 pages, was on art. And I said, what, you can do this? And this is possible? This is sociology? We didn't talk about anything like this, with the juvenile delinquency and the social problems, framing of the undergraduate curriculum. So this was much more kind of European style, kind of a cultural science type approach, and it just was, to me, exciting. It's so vast in its sweep. It's trying to cover 2.5 millennia and these swings and culture mentalities, and it was incredibly ambitious. Of course, I didn't know at the time. I didn't maybe read the footnotes carefully enough, but he had kind of a team of researchers, including Merton, that were digging up his data. Then he would interpret the data, and he was making the overall argument. But he had, in fact, around Harvard, it was a standing joke that he was hiring all these displaced European intellectuals. And the New Deal was going on at that time here, and there was something called the Works Progress Association, I think, the WPA. And so critics at Harvard called Sorokin's team the White Russian WPA, like he was just hiring. They had Rockefeller money to employ these researchers, so that was kind of a dig at, but they were good scholars, but they were, some of them were displaced by the revolution, had emigrated to Europe, like Nikolai Lowsky and Ivan Lapshin. They had migrated to Europe. So anyway, I got interested in him through the dynamics primarily. And then a little bit later, I was in New York visiting an uncle of mine, and I went over to Columbia University, and I went to the main library. And at St. Louis U, the stacks were open. You could just walk around and browse. And I learned a lot just by walking around the stacks and browsing. Well, at Columbia, everything was restricted. So you had to go and see what privileges you had or didn't have. So they said, well, you can go to this one room where they have sociology stuff. So I went to this room, and there was a book by Sorokin that I hadn't seen called Society, Culture, and Personality. And it's a kind of a treatise. It's the kind of thing you don't see anymore, like 600 pages. And it was really kind of like his intro course and all his courses rolled into one. And again, the central focus was meaningful human interaction. And then he had all this things about stratification and cultural change and mobility and so forth. And I thought, well, this is, to me, what was great stuff, and particularly I was coming around to kind of this sort of more cultural approach and meaningfulness, And so those two things got me going, and I sort of forgave him for being such a harsh critic, but he was pretty much harsh on everybody. So that's how we started, and I had never imagined that I would have been then spend years chasing around after him and getting to know his family and having dinner at his home and seeing his study and even going up to their summer place and spending a day up at the summer place and just getting so deeply involved with it. And it's kind of hard to explain, like, why do that? It's not a good career move. I mean, right?
Well, speaking of careers, you start off the book with a biography of Sorokin, and that was more fascinating than I would have expected, because I'm not necessarily into the biographies of intellectuals, but also I probably am biased by thinking of it like people like me who, my path was pretty straightforward. I went to school. I was good at school. I stayed in school. Then you look at Sorokin, and this guy grew up when was he born? In the 19th century?
1889.
Yeah, and he grew up in Russia. He's half Russian and half Komi, which is not a people I was very familiar with until I read your book and looked up that, an indigenous people of the Russian area. And it seemed like he had a pretty rough youth. Like, he grew up roughing it, camping out a lot and traveling around. And then, of course, comes the revolution. And can you say a little about his experiences in the Russian Revolution?
Well, he had gotten into politics in high school and had gotten himself kicked out for being an activist in the so-called Social Revolutionary Party. So this was one of a number of anti-Tsarist parties, and they were more of a rural-oriented, peasant-oriented, which was his background. He came from a rural area, and Russia was still mostly peasants. So as opposed to the Marxists that were, as you know, were urban and industrial in their orientation. So the social revolutionaries favored a kind of communal socialism, shared property, that was called the village mir, where they did redistributed land from time to time, and land was held in common. So he was an angry guy, but he was angry at the same time that the whole generation was angry. If you look at this 1905 revolution, which is not too well known because people think of the 1917 events when there were actually two revolutions in 1917, but the 1905 is very important also because then the Tsar had to give some concessions, limited reforms. They created a legislature. Of course, they could shut it down anytime they wanted to, but they made a little bit more like the European kind of a constitutional monarchy, sort of moving in that direction. But he was an angry guy, and we have to maybe keep in mind this guy is an orphan. His father was somewhat violent, beat him up. His father was alcoholic, and so there was a lot of anger there, maybe just even in the family, but there was a lot of anger in the country, and the generation of that time was really kind of a revolutionary generation. So he was doing what a lot of the other people were doing, but he found out he was very good at public speaking. He was a kind of orator, and it just came to him sort of naturally, and he became an organizer. So after he quit, after he was expelled and imprisoned, the first of his 6 imprisonments, as he always said, 300 at Tsars and 300 at communists, he spent a lot of time behind bars. The average sociologist doesn't go through this. He became an organizer, but then he kind of became burned out, and he had some narrow escapes. And so he decided to gravitate to St. Petersburg and try to continue his education. He had to go to night school to meet the requirements to get into university. And from then on, he became a little bit more, he began to get more what we might consider standard career, although the events that followed still almost cost him his life. So it really started when he was about 16 years old, and just for whatever reason became passionately involved in the movement to get rid of Tsarism. But then in the revolutionary year itself, in the summer, he joins the government of Kerensky, this provisional government that took office after the Tsar abdicated in the spring. And he became a secretary to Kerensky. So this was actually kind of a part-time job, but he was an insider at this point. But it also placed him more in danger because then when the Bolsheviks took power, they were going to basically eliminate anybody associated with the Kerensky regime. So then he was living a kind of double life as a professor and as a political activist. So, and then eventually when the British invasion of the North didn't come about, and he had been trying to support this, people don't know that there was an Allied intervention to try to overturn the Bolshevik coup. So then he turned himself in and was sentenced to death and was reprieved by Lenin, and then began a more conventional academic life. So it was, as dramatic as you could get. And he just felt somehow maybe it was providential that he was spared because his 2 brothers died during the revolutionary period.
Yeah, it's crazy. And he witnessed famine firsthand too.
Right. He went out and observed, and basically people had eaten everything they could eat, and there was nothing left to eat, and they were just sitting there waiting to die. And so this is similar to also what happened in Ukraine shortly thereafter. And then 10 years later, when Stalin starved Ukraine for a year, there's a book on this called Red Famine by Anne Applebaum, and the Holodomor, as they call it, which is their word for famine. It was really just, I read that book recently, and it was just similar to what Sorokin said, that, they eat everything and then you just sit and wait to die. So he said after that, he was fearless, but he was still a kind of an artful dodger. Anybody that wasn't an artful dodger just ended up pretty much in prison or dead, and he was a little bit quick on his feet, but he became, an opponent of the regime. But this famine was quite brutal. And the records were suppressed and the deaths were reported as, other causes rather than what there really was. But the revolution and the war, particularly World War One, there had destroyed, the crop production and the means of transportation, and what food there was couldn't get to where it was needed, and it was all really a consequence of the war and the violence. It wasn't really a climate event. So yeah, he saw it firsthand, and after that, he just said that, it just affected him so deeply that from then on, he was a little bit tormented by what humans were doing to one another. And he's been writing about this idea of the crisis of our age, which became a central idea later on, which was never accepted in this country, in America, because it was the American century, when things were sort of on the upswing here. And here you have this displaced Russian talking about some kind of crisis, and it didn't sell. It didn't go over. And people didn't buy it. But he saw at firsthand so much violence and suffering that he thought, well, this is not just normal times. You can't define this as normal, and it's kind of self-inflicted, and it's increasingly global. So all of that together. But he was lucky that he had been on the political left. Some of his students interceded with Lenin. People that had taken courses from him went to Lenin and said, he helped the workers. He was on our side. Okay, he's an SR. He's not a one of us, but he worked for the revolution. He tried to help the people. So Lenin decided, well, we need people like this in a new social order. We're going to try to turn around these intellectuals and use them to help build the socialist communist order. We can't kill off all the intellectuals.
You mentioned he'd written some about hunger being a theme in human existence. Have you read much on his writings about hunger?
Well, there's a book that only came out in 1975 called Hunger as a Factor in Human Affairs, and it was based on his studies of famine, but the authorities seized the plates before it could be printed. So it didn't come out in Russian, but he smuggled out a manuscript, and then his wife translated it after his death. So he must have felt somewhat that it wasn't like his best work, because he was very good at getting his stuff out and getting it translated, all around the world. And he had took this with him, but he didn't really apparently try to get it translated the way that he got some of his other works. He was also critical of his early work on revolution. I mean, he had taken, a very kind of sociobiological stance early on. He was with this Psychoneurological Institute, and he went through this sort of positivist phase, and then he became this cultural sociologist. So he really changed. But he did write this in the early 1920s, but it only came out in 1975, University of Florida Press. But he had a friend there named T. Lynn Smith, who'd been a student of rural sociology at Sorokin. And one of the things that wasn't in the book was his work in rural sociology. And he was very big in rural sociology in the 1920s. When he was at the University of Minnesota, he was one of the leading rural sociologists. And he had a very large work out called A Systematic Source Book in Rural Sociology, 3 volumes. He had a couple co-editors. And then he and his friend Carl Zimmerman brought out the Principles of Rural Urban Sociology, which is another 600-page book. These are like massive tomes, like you don't much see anymore. And so anyway, this was the earlier, more positivistic stuff. And then he was reading Spengler, Oswald Spengler, at some point, and it's hard to know when, because he read so many people. It's hard to trace influences on him because he was a kind of encyclopedist. And he actually said in one of his letters that I can never find that one of his professors was kind of a walking encyclopedia, and he also wished to be someday a walking encyclopedia himself. And so he was one of the last sort of would-be aspiring, encyclopedists. So it's hard to trace an influence on people. I emphasize, Tolstoy a lot in the book, and but it's somewhat speculative because you can't actually prove it. But with Tolstoy, at least he wrote an essay on him and he quotes him. But he did say that Spengler was a great thinker, and that I think influenced him to take this kind of civilizations approach that he adopted in the late 20s, early 30s.
One of the chapters talks about how he conceptualized the field of sociology and what distinguishes it. Perennial concern in sociology. We don't know how to define ourselves. But what I found interesting in that was you have the standard narrative of sociology that the field was born in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, amid all the changes of industrialization and urbanization, causing the need to reflect on social order. And then you have Sorokin saying, no, the field is actually 3,000 years old. Can you explain what he means by that?
No, I think his view is there was always something like sociology, that he did admit that it became more, an academic field, more of a scientific field in the kind of modern sense, but that people have always reflected on their experience in, living in organized groups. And so, Merton would disagree and say, well, this is what he called adumbrationism, that like this is more like a foreshadowing of sociology, that sociology really didn't emerge until more modern times. But Sorokin's view was there was always something like sociology around, just like there was always poetry and there was always music, and so forth. And so, as you saw in the book, that he said, if I have to point to a systematic sociologist, it's this Ibn Khaldun, who's this Arab thinker in the Middle Ages. So he's non-European and perhaps non-white also. And he said, well, this is like all the main problems of sociology are laid out in his work. And Comte comes up with this new name, but it's not really a new thing. So it's interesting because in a way, it connects with some of the more recent stuff like the anti-colonial stuff in the field, that this Eurocentrism and so forth. Because, Sorokin would read these ancient texts, and he would say, well, the Buddhist logicians and Confucius and so forth, he would trace it back. So he felt that even in popular sayings, there were sociological insights. He felt that in literature, a lot of novels were better pieces of sociology than journal articles. He was very harsh on a lot of typical journal articles. He thought they didn't take us really anywhere. And he had some exchanges with Reed Bain, who was the editor of the American Sociological Review and fairly prominent at that time in the profession. And he got angry at him one time and said, well, your journal doesn't publish anything of importance. This is all trivial stuff, and a great novel tells us a lot more than an issue of the American Sociological Review does. So it's a little bit like, Andy Abbott recently, that book, The Varieties of Sociological Imagination, or maybe that's not what he exactly, he wrote under the pen name Barbara Salarenth for some unknown reason. And looking at literatures around the world, and different approaches, feeling like, the American style sociology is getting kind of locked into maybe just kind of a one paradigm, approach, kind of this conflict approach that has become dominant. So, I think it would connect, with this, with Abbott's recent thing, that I'm not sure how people are familiar with it.
Yeah, reading that line really made me stop and think. And I was getting ready to argue the point, but when you got to the example of Khaldun, who I've never read, but I'm familiar with his ideas secondhand. And I thought, yeah, we can claim Khaldun. If we're going to, talk about, modern comparative historical stuff, tracing, the rise and fall of political institutions, or when you get political instability, Khaldun's stuff on civilizational cycles and the rise and fall of dynasties, I think would count as a kind of macro sociology. And speaking of like that idea of looking at cycles and stages in human life, I was surprised when I read in the book that Sorokin was, I believe, roommates with Nikolai Kondratyev, who came up with the idea of these, 80-year economic super cycles. And then Sorokin himself has his idea of civilizational or cultural cycles. Can you say a little bit about Sorokin's model of civilizational change?
Right. Well, he took this long-term view, that if you study the data, you see these swings in, you could say paradigms or just what he calls culture mentalities. And it's interesting to speculate whether his roommate, who ended up being killed, by Stalin in 1938, uh, had some influence talking about these long, they're called Kondratiev waves still, I think, in economics, as long waves. But you can observe these swings. So he called it trendless fluctuation. So he's usually categorized as a cyclical theorist, but he said it's not cyclical, it's trendless fluctuation. And the idea is that neither of the two sort of basic mentalities we seem to see in human culture captures everything about reality. And so human beings are kind of always swinging back and forth between their idea of what is real and what is valuable. So I don't know when that began, but Russian. You have to keep in mind he read a lot of history, and one of his major professors was also a major historian. And so, as opposed to today, I mean, how many sociology students take any history to speak of? They had a kind of I've said in the book, a sort of a world history point of view. Maybe it's somewhat still Eurocentric or Northern centric, somewhat, but it's very broad. Much broader than what we get now. And so I think it's rooted in his a lot of his undergraduate and graduate reading of history. And you might remember that their approach to graduate study was they gave you a list of several hundred readings, and you had to come back and take an exam after you had said you had read everything on this massive list. And a great deal of that were historical works, including multi-volume works. So, Max Weber came into sociology somewhat from history, and then Germans, and other people more in this country came out of more of economics. People started in economics and came into sociology, like Edward Ross, and there were quite a few people. Parsons' background, was economics, but the history was foundational to his outlook. So it's dialectical model of the the opposition of different points of view, but it's a sort of complementary dialectic. It's not like one is. It's not so much like the Marxist dialectic where it's a zero sum game. The one side wins and the other side loses. It's more like their hegemony fluctuates over time. Is what the record seems to show in the case of what's called Western civilization. So I don't know where he conceived this idea of 2.5 millennia, because nobody in their right mind would try to write about 2.5 millennia. And the fact that he had Rockefeller money to do this is also somewhat miraculous, because this is the Depression, and everybody, including Harvard, is losing money on their investments, and they're cutting corners and letting faculty go and everything else. And meanwhile, he's carrying on this project for particularly 6 years, like from 1931 to 36, with Rockefeller money, which not very many universities have. They gave Harvard a 10-year grant. And there was a committee there, the Committee on Research in the Social Sciences, and Sorokin had a place on the committee. So, I mean, he wouldn't have been able to do this at Minnesota. I think maybe I mentioned it in the book that had he stayed at Minnesota, which wanted to keep him, of course, he would not have been able to do his major work. We wouldn't be talking about this stuff right now.
Regarding that study of civilizations and cultures, you mentioned him having a big team of researchers working under him and producing lots of data. Do you have like a sense of what that looked like? I mean, how was the data collected, or how were these things collated? Is there a big folder somewhere with reams of paper from this study, or did they summarize things in some fashion?
But it created massive tables, and it was different subject by subject, science versus literature versus architecture. But he had people that were fairly expert. He had a Russian guy who was a kind of military historian. So he wanted to count all of the uprisings and wars and and try to collate them with the changes in culture mentalities, try to show there was a correlation. Meanwhile, Merton was digging into the fluctuations of scientific discoveries, like centuries where there are a lot of scientific discoveries, centuries where there are few scientific discoveries. How do these correlate with these kind of sacred and secular, worldviews? Well, during the secular, the sacred period, you have less science. During the secular, you have more science. So try to show this, century by century. So there were reams and reams of data, which he didn't. They kept some of it because there is a collection of some of his correspondence up in Saskatoon, Canada, at the University of Saskatchewan. And I know that his son, Sergei, held on to some of these boxes of data, like the one on wars and revolutions. And they're always trying to negotiate with the university a little bit about the collection and how the papers were going to be organized. There was an annual lecture that they did for many years, and they were published. And it was always kind of keeping one eye on, how is the university dealing with father's, materials? And, if I tell them I have a little more stuff here, can I leverage them to, do a little bit more on their end? Because when I went up there years ago, it was all higgledy-piggledy, and nothing was well organized whatsoever. And it was mostly his later stuff with his altruism period, so-called, where he was really kind of kicked out of the field for just being this sort of social critic and utopian, let's all love one another and so forth. Although he tried to be more practical about it. And but that really got him kicked out of the, we study hate, we don't study love, that's who we are, right? But there was some boxes, but he didn't hang on to things so much the way that someone like Parsons did. Parsons was an absolute pack rat, and he kept like first drafts of things. Parsons would write the first draft in pencil, and he had nice handwriting if you look in his papers. And then there might be draft 2 and draft 3 and so forth. And we found one year a paper on Zimmel that was literally in a box in the basement of William James Hall. That some researcher noticed by chance and contacted my friend Bill Buxton, who was at Harvard doing research, said, "Bill, you might want to look at this. This looks like some Parsons stuff." It was just like a box in the basement of stuff that had been, just neglected and, but kept. But Sorokin was more like, okay, we're done with that. On to the next study, So not too much of the raw data is still around, I don't think. But Merton really got a lot out of it, more than, in a way, more than we ever admitted, because his stuff on sociology of science, in a way, began with his work with Sorokin on the fluctuations of scientific discoveries. It's just that he had also, by then, absorbed this idea of the Protestant ethic from Parsons, who, had translated Weber's essay in the 1930 book and was teaching it, to the graduate students. So it was the two of them together that really launched Merton. But he sort of shied away from his association with Sorokin as Sorokin became discredited. And then later on, he helped actually reintegrate him. So there was a lot of ambivalence in that relationship with Merton.
Interesting. Back to the civilizational model. So you have these different culture focuses. The one that's sensate, I believe is the term, a materialistic focus, and the other one that's ideational.
Right. So basically it's spiritual and secular. Uh-huh. So the one says that reality is fundamentally, material, and it's what we can get through our senses, and there's nothing else. And the other says that no, there's something, it's primarily spiritual, and the material is less valuable, So Sorokin says that you can make a case that both of these are reflected in what he called the infinite manifold. And so neither culture actually maps out the infinite manifold because it's so vast, you can't really manage, but they map parts of it, and then they realize, well, we've left out something important, and there's sort of a swing back to recovering, what had been left out. But in between, it's these transitional periods are filled with conflict. So this is kind of like the Durkheim anomy idea, is that there's a breakdown of beliefs and values and norms. And so it's not smooth. So the wars and revolutions and uprisings occur largely in these transitional periods, what you could call anomy periods. There are these ruptures. So it's not just a smooth back and forth. But, they were assigning, again, things like Toynbee's study of history. The students were made to read things like these, St. Augustine, the City of God, and the Toynbee's study of history. And there were books like Becker and Barnes did a book called Social Thought from Lore to Science, which when I was a grad student was still being assigned. And this goes back to really ancient times. And they talk about China, they talk about India. There's a chapter on Japan, there's a chapter on Turkey. And so the field was maybe, in a sense, less Eurocentric than people think at that time, because the students were required to read about these earlier efforts. So it was this idea that we're becoming a science. Well, let's look at where we started and where we are today. And then we stopped reading stuff like that, basically. But that was featured at Harvard. But I think Toynbee and he and Toynbee had an interchange, and later on he wrote a book called Modern Social and Historical Philosophies, where he talked about the convergence of different civilizational thinkers on, the number of civilizations and, certain features of civilizational change. So I don't know when he read Toynbee, and Toynbee had a rise and fall kind of model of, and I think he talked about like the youth and maturity and old age and so forth of civilizations. So he was picking up on that as well. So he wasn't the only one, but the people that were doing it were outside sociology. I mean, you got Spengler and you had Toynbee and people like that were not known as sociologists per se. So that's why he said sociology was becoming more and more trivial. He said we're getting little specks of knowledge. He called specks. We're getting specks of knowledge. Instead of
you mentioned he became very critical of American sociology, and if you read the first half of the biography, it seems like a classic rise and good fortune tale. He's survived the political upheavals in Russia. He's come to America. He's had some good luck with his positions, and things are all coming up Sorokin. And then it seems like he has a big falling out with American sociology. Can you say a little bit about why he and the field in the U.S. didn't mix?
Early on, he wrote an article comparing European and American sociology. So to get his point of view, it's important to look at this late 1920s article. He thought the Europeans were more intellectual and they had more of a historical sense, but they were overly speculative. And he thought the Americans were better grounded, but that they tended to be kind of mastered by their data, like the data was in control. And he said it was also tended to be somewhat mechanical. So I think he had a bias initially that the European, just like with Parsons, that the European approach was intellectually better than the American approach. But the American approach was more grounded. So he saw that both, and he said overall, it's better in America. It's more, academic here. In Europe, you have a lot of private scholars doing sociology. The universities haven't adopted it as much as here. That might still be true. I hear about things in Germany and so forth. It sounds like, sociology is in a lot of trouble over there. So there might have been a certain kind of European bias. And then he says in his autobiography, he thinks that this approach of having to read this vast list of sources is superior to taking, routine graduate coursework. But that's his bias. You can argue back the other way a little bit too, because all he ever had to do was get through one exam. It might have been a tough exam, but instead of passing course by course, basically you just had to sit one exam, and if you were good at writing, you might get through it without actually having read all those 500 sources you were supposed to read. But he did have that bias. But then, if you really want to see his falling out. And you read the Fads and Foibles in Sociology from 1956 or 57, and where he goes after a whole series of things that were popular, like small groups. Small group research was very popular at that time. And he says, well, that doesn't make any more sense than having a science of small plants. We don't have a science of small plants, do we? And what is this small group stuff? And he went after Lloyd Warner's famous classification of social classes, upper middle, lower middle, and so forth. And he skewers. It starts out with the amnesia and the new Columbuses, that people don't know the history of their field. So that goes back to they should be reading Ibn Khaldun, they should be reading Augustine, and they should be reading Confucius, and Plato and Aristotle, and get some broader, perspective. But he went after, and he went after testing. He called testomania and quantophrenia and numerology. And as someone said, it's a rich vituperative vocabulary. And a University of Chicago reviewer, Donald Horton, said it was a pitiable climax to a distinguished career. It basically, kind of like Mills writing the sociological imagination and attacking pretty much everybody in sociology in 1959. I mean, Mills spared Merton, but of course he attacked Merton's colleague Lazarsfeld, pretty ferociously. But it's a little bit like Mills dumping on the whole field, but some of it has held up pretty well in terms of his critique of testing and the weaknesses of survey methodology and so forth. But there's a lot of satire in there and polemics, and well, it's actually rather entertaining if you are open to what he's saying. But he wanted to call it mistakes and delusions, so that was his. But they cleaned it up and said, well, let's make it a little bit more gentle and call it fads and foibles. But he really, in his mind, it was mistakes and delusions of American sociology, beginning with they don't know their own history. So that's the one to. So then you can see the difficulty of reintegrating him. So this is 1956, 57. And then 1963, he wins the ASA presidency on a write-in campaign that people like Merton helped to organize. But, he had really attacked a lot of people in the field, and there were a lot of bad feelings toward him, and, that he had, like he started it. Pete, you started it, so it's on you, So, but he felt like they were missing the big story. So the big story was the historical story of the crisis of our age, and that we were missing the big story for a lot of very small scale studies of various selected social problems. So he said one. So it actually in 1940 he gave an address in Chicago at the National Convention of what was then the American Sociological Society, And he called it the nature of the challenge. And he basically said history will give sociology a grade of D, not quite failing, but not really a high passing grade, because it's missing the really big issues. And of course, this was right as World War II was underway, and he felt vindicated. So he felt, in 1937, he publishes this work talking about the crisis of our age. In a couple of years, World War II was really sort of already underway. At that point, the Japanese had invaded China and so forth. But really, if you'd make 1939 the start date, then he would feel vindicated that he had got it right, and that sociologists were missing, the really big story. So that's how I would have kind of explained it. But he was an angry guy, so that's part of it to begin with, and he tended to think his point of view was superior to other point of view. He was a very smart guy, and sometimes very hard for very smart people not to think they're better than everybody else. Bertrand Russell said at one point, like, a really clever person cannot convey to a non-clever person certain insights or ideas, because a non-clever person just won't get it. There's just this gap, and
yeah. Well, I might be a non-clever person because I still don't quite have a clear picture of what Sorokin's vision as an alternative was. So I know he like critiques the empiricism of American sociology, but at the same time, he seems to be working hard to generate these huge volumes of data and information for developing his ideas. And I would say the chapter I struggled the most with was the chapter on what is integral. I can't even say the word correctly. Integralism.
Right. That's in some ways the most important because that is his alternative. So it's this dialectical approach, which says that we really need to it's a synthetic thing. We really need to synthesize the best of each of these approaches. Because he said, the sensate, there's good features of sensate culture. And in fact, when his TA, Edward Triakian, late Edward Triakian of Duke, came over to his house for dinner, having been warned that Sorokin was this fearsome presence and everything, Sorokin opened the door and had a bottle of wine and says, "Let us have best of sensate culture." And this is how he liked wine. And this was how he greeted him. So he felt that the sensate culture was what he called overripe. It was disintegrating. It was going to an extreme, to an excess. It was relative. In other words, it was relativistic to begin with, because the secular culture tends to be more relativistic. The other one tends to be more absolutist. So they tend to go to extremes, to become extremely absolutist, or they become extremely relativistic. Then they begin to swing back because people realize, we have to make a correction here. But they go to kind of an extreme of relativism. So his approach was, okay, we need an integral sociology, which would combine, the best features of, you could say the American and European, traditions. I mean, in a sense, obviously he was interested in, these other traditions as well. But he also was interested in phenomenology. So that's part of it. And with this meaningfulness. So he was friends with George Gurvich, who made a name for himself in phenomenology. So Gurvich was one of these emigres from the Soviet Union in 1922, when they let a lot of people out because they decided they couldn't kill everybody. And why not just let some of these people go? So a lot of them then went to France. So Gurvich went to France, but he ended up here, I think. But in the 1940s, he began publishing on the state of sociology, and he did a famous book on phenomenology. So anyway, the idea of integralism is this. It's kind of like his what he called idealistic culture, which he then called integral culture. So it's synthetic. So it's the idea of combining the best of the two opposites. So he emphasized particularly intuition. So he felt that intuition was underemphasized in Western sociology. That it was too trapped in just this, sort of raw empiricism. So then, as I tried to explain, there was that whole tradition of intuitionism in Russian philosophy, and I linked him to the movement called Slavophilism in the mid 19th century, and that even they talked about integral knowledge. So I think that he picked up this idea of integral knowledge from the so-called Slavophile, which means the lovers of the Slavic, tradition, and they felt that the Europeans were too materialistic, the Europeans were too empirical, and they were missing the spiritual and the intuitional. So anyway, this got him in trouble because people like Merton and then Bernard Barber, who critiqued him in one of the Festschrifts, said, well, you can use intuition to discover something, but you can't use it to validate it or verify it. Okay, so it's a method maybe for discovery, but you can't use it as a method of proof. So that was kind of their rebuttal. But this is what he was aiming at, was the combination of the best of both of these approaches.
All right. And towards the end of his life, he also began to emphasize the sociology of love.
Right.
And I found this fascinating too, because I'm reading it and I'm thinking, I don't know to what extent this is sociology versus philosophy, but the idea of making love a subject of consideration does seem like an important idea to me. Could you say a little bit about his sociology of love?
Right. So he'd been writing about all sorts of social problems. He wrote about revolution. He wrote about famine. He writes about the crisis of our age. And The Crisis of Our Age comes out as a book in 1941. And he says in his autobiography, he got kind of depressed, that he just sees all this violence all around him. And of course, he's lost his parents, he's lost his brothers, he's lost many colleagues and friends in a senseless violence. What can we do about it? Where can we start? Is there a starting point? So he hits on this idea of altruism as a way to try to begin building a new and better society and culture, and that everybody can participate. You don't have to wait for, a revolution. You don't have to wait for people at the top. Everybody can lend a hand. So he wrote a book in 1948 called Reconstruction of Humanity, in which he argued that these various other remedies, like make the world more democratic, well, the democracies are, they're just as warlike as the autocracies. Well, let's expand education. Well, the higher educated societies are just as warlike as the less educated societies, and so forth. And the only thing that we can really come back to is a kind of transcendental value system that's binding on people. It's also, but this is the trick. How do you make it binding? Who can impose this in terms of an authority? But anyway, he thought, well, we can all begin to make a difference. Sociologists, a lot of people come to the field, they want to make a difference. And he said, this is really, we need this attitude. We need a value system based on mutual aid and respect for one another, and seeing the divine. He said, we've lost a sense of the divine and the human, And so I trace it, of course, somewhat, to Tolstoy, or Lev Tolstoy, who had written somewhat along the same lines. He had written that book in 1894. Let's see. Tolstoy wrote a book called What to Do. But he wrote a book called The Kingdom of God is Within You. So this is, in a sense, what Sorokin is also saying in a kind of more sociological way. And Tolstoy, tried to develop what he called an earthly form of Christianity. I mean, in a way, it's kind of Unitarianism. If you look at Tolstoy was doing this, from the 1840s onward, to some degree. I mean, mostly later, but he kind of got the idea in the 1840s, which is when kind of this Unitarian Transcendentalist movement also is very, very strong, kind of takes over at Harvard and other places. But the kingdom of God is within you, and that what we need is this sort of law of love, and this is the only thing that's going to overcome these other conflicts, based on class or race or whatever. So yeah, it spans a lot of different fields. I mean, if you look at these collections, he has two edited collections, and he's got people there from all over the place. He's got from the Hindu tradition, and he's got Mennonites in there, and he's got Islamic thinkers and all kinds of people that would not be regarded as sociologists, talking about how to get beyond ego-driven, culture and something more generous and more noble. And then his book, The Ways and Power of Love, should be considered one of his major works. But he does say that love is not just, this interpersonal thing, but even it's the binding force in the universe. Now, recently in this evolutionary theory, I see that there's an increasing emphasis on evolution happened through cooperation, including even at the bacterial or molecular level. In ancient times, that there was a kind of a fusion of molecular bacterial, but they weren't fighting one another, that they were actually cooperating. So Sorokin was also big on Kropotkin, who had written about mutual aid in evolution. So he thought, well, can we do something about the crisis of our age? So that was, his attempt to, kind of light a fire and offer some kind of an alternative, but, very, very broad gauge. I mean, if you look at the range of people in these two edited collections, it's extremely broad. But he talks about the different features of love, the ontological, the biological, the psychological, the social, the cultural, and talks about it as an energy. So I don't know where that comes from. I don't know where he got that idea. But he had this idea that in all of us is what he called the superconscious. And the superconscious is connected with intuition. And he says, this is the source of our creativity. It's not so much rational calculation. It's the real source of our creativity is in the intuition and the superconscious, which is somewhat what used to be called the soul or something like the soul. Um, but there is he has a whole series of quotes from people, these great inventors and uh, outstanding people in various fields, talking about how they came up with their symphony or their scientific discovery, and it was this flash of intuition would come to them when they were least expecting it. So he tried to make this case that intuition is foundational to all forms of knowledge. That even for us to say that a proposition makes sense, it only makes sense not on so much the rational level, but it has to be something kind of beyond or below the rational level to say this proposition, makes sense. So he was arguing that intuition is foundational to all knowledge, but also the source of creativity. So creativity is a big notion with Sorokin, which you don't see as much in others. I've said we could kind of go beyond the sociology of love, and we could do sociology with love, and that would, because we're a pretty angry field, and there's a lot to be angry about. What we attract, if you look at the type of people that come to sociology, a lot of people are pretty angry, and they have cause. They have cause to be angry. But we can also, I think, go beyond, because people said to Sorokin, well, you're kind of an angry guy, I mean, you're writing about love, but I mean, you're not a sweet guy, And he kind of said, well, you don't have to practice it to study it. Exactly. And he kind of had trouble letting go of, the thing with Parsons rankled him. When people saying Parsons is the greatest sociologist, it just rankled him. He could never quite let go of it, he could never quite let go of his anger. I think he struggled with it. I think he tried, but. Can we do sociology? What would that mean to do sociology with love? I tried to talk about that years ago. It's a long time ago now in my 2012 presidential talk, to the regional association. So I think he opened some things up for us. He said, well, you can study art, and you can study love, and you can read ancient works, and you can read broadly, cross-culturally, you can read, before it was a popular thing to do, before people said, decolonial or whatever you want to call it, So he had a very vast, outlook, but very provocative, So I've tried to say that it connects with some of the controversies of today about things like intelligent design. I think there's a movie coming out called A Story of Everything or something like this. It's just coming out this week or something. And I think it deals with this intelligent design perspective that's been argued back and forth now for a couple decades among scientists and philosophers. So, because you're saying, who are we and what are we? Who are we really? Are we spiritual? Are we material? Who are we? What are we? Is the reality simply what we can see and touch and feel? Or is there more to it? Is there more to it than that? And I think that's very much in the current discourse. And I mentioned also, like, the near-death experience literature is something that seems in some ways to me to connect, because people that have these experiences all say there's a lot more than what we experience here and now, that there's much that this is a kind of a dreamlike state, and that they felt when they were out of their body and so forth, that they were much more alert, and they had these abilities were really expanded, and there's a very, very large literature on that, and I find some of it easier to accept than others, but there's a vast and growing literature about things like this, these paranormal states, so. He was predicting a renewed spirituality. People saying, well, he wants to go back to the Middle Ages, and he wants to go back to this old, superstition. But he was saying, no, there's going to be a new type of spirituality that's going to come. And it could be this ideational form. He said, I'd prefer it would be this idealistic or integral form. I don't know what form it's going to take, but I believe that people will begin to see that there is a spiritual dimension. And it's accessible through our superconscious and intuition and so forth. and it's going to happen because this is where things are tending.
All right, one last question, and to bring the big questions back down to the grubby realities of academia. If you right now were directing a thesis or dissertation student who was interested broadly in Sorokin's work, where would you point them for making some contribution? What sort of topic or sort of research would you shove them towards?
Well, it's a good question. There is a lot happening in this area of altruism, and there are particular programs now, and it's become interdisciplinary. But you have to look for a kind of a niche. You know what it's like with our field right now, how hard it is overall, and how we're losing majors. And we were just publishing an article in American Sociologist. It just went to press on the loss of majors, nationwide and so forth. So you have the problem of, well, someone wants to do a thesis on civilizational analysis. What are they going to do for a living? But I don't know. I mean, in terms of altruism and in the workplace, things like corporate responsibility. To me, it's something I've written about years ago. That's stuff like that is still, I would say organizational responsibility, not just in the business sector, but how do you? I was just reading recently about some of the scandals with the insurance companies and denying people benefits and then the profiteering and all of this. But how do you work for more kind of organizational responsibility? But he also had this political dimension there. If someone wants to go into politics, he did at the very end talk about what kind of political leadership do we need? So you could try to promote, to follow that out a little bit. God knows that the politics that we're seeing now is not what anybody would wish to see. So it depends, because we're constrained by the fact that we're losing majors, and that we have to fight for a place in academia, and we're better off in applied areas like criminology or demography or maybe gerontology, than in just let's talk about the rise and fall of civilizations. Why don't we? So I don't know, something like that, like organizational behaviors, maybe political leadership, things like this. You could take some of his work.
Well, thank you, Larry. As my grandfather would have said, I've burnt up your nickel today. Kept you here a whole hour. But I appreciate you taking the time to talk about this book. I found it very enlightening. I'd read a little Sorokin before in grad school, but I really was ignorant of the great breadth and volume of his output and all the different ideas that were in it. So I felt I learned a lot from this book.
Well, I try to write in such a way that people that knew nothing about Sorokin would get something from it, and people that did know something about him would also feel they got at least something from it as well. And probably the most distinctive thing about it was the emphasis on, the Russian tradition, his connection with the Russian tradition that people would otherwise probably not notice. You just wouldn't, if you just think of his career in America, you wouldn't see where does integralism really come from, So I tried maybe to make some contribution in that regard. I hope so. I hope some people read it.
I'm sure they will. I'll have a link in the description to where my listeners can buy a copy. Thank you, Larry, for joining me. This has been the Bullfish Hole Podcast.